All right, so we'll begin our session. Uh, Welcome to another session of DevCamp. I hope you can see my screen, yes? All right, great. So we'll start off with our session. So for today's session, we'll be looking at JavaScript. We'll have a good introduction to JavaScript. And then, so for today's session, we've planned a brief introduction to JavaScript. We'll see the history of JavaScript. I think it's important for everybody to know the basics. I mean, the introduction, the history to JavaScript in order to, have a good grasp of the session. And then we'll have the basics of JavaScript, everything that's common with all the other languages, programming languages like you have variables, you have conditional and looping statements. So we'll take a look at all of that. And then we'll be moving on to document object model. That is a very interesting part. And then we'll have a special bonus section for you guys. So before we start this session, I just want to tell you that for the next session, we'll be putting on a poll. So fill that out throughout the session. You can just tell us what you want to learn for the next session. It will be based on JavaScript. So today's session, I hope will be really helpful to you guys to grasp on all the further sessions. So let's begin. All right. So introduction to JavaScript. JavaScript is a lightweight interpreted programming language, right? So an interpreted programming language is also called a scripting language. So that's you got the word script out of the JavaScript now. At any point of time, all of you programmers would have thought, why do we have Java in the word JavaScript, right? Are they in any way related? So let me tell you the story of JavaScript, how it originated, right? So it all started with Netscape Navigator. It was a really popular browser back in the 1995. Before the introduction to JavaScript, all the websites were not that interactive or dynamic. So Netscape Navigator wanted to make their websites dynamic and everything. So they created JavaScript. Initially, they were called Mocha because JavaScript loves. I mean, programmers love coffee, right? So why Mocha? The thing is, they in the 1990s, Java was a really popular language, right? So they wanted a programming language, which is similar to Java, and we could use that for website building, right? To make the websites interactive and dynamic. Listen to all the events that going on in the browser. Now, keep this story in mind, and that is pretty important. So we'll come back to it. Then how does it work? So how does JavaScript work? I told you that it is an interpreted language, right? So what happens is at the word interpretation and compilation, they don't really have a difference in the modern browsers because right, interpreted languages are pretty slow compared to compiled languages. So what they do is they have something called just-in-time compilation now. So just-in-time compilation, what it does is it interprets the language, but it takes the most frequently used code and compiles them. So best of both worlds. So that's how JavaScript works in the modern browsers. And to run, it's pretty interesting, right? All the other languages have their own integrated development environment, right? Like Python has PyCharm and Java has Eclipse and C++ has Dev C++. But why does JavaScript work in browser, right? So we have something called the JavaScript engine. That's what executes the JavaScript code behind the scenes in your browser. And since all the browsers are like corporate companies, they need a good catchy name. So Google Chrome has the V8 engine, and Mozilla Firefox has the Spider Monkey. Internet Explorer had Chakra Core. So that's the background as how JavaScript is compiled in your browser. Now, ECMAScript. Okay, so that's a lot of scripts are there, right? So what is ECMAScript? If you remember the story I told you in the beginning, so Netscape Navigator started JavaScript to make it more interactive and dynamic, right? Now, all the other browsers wanted that functionality too. So what they did is they made their own version of JavaScript, right? say for example, Internet Explorer came up with something called JavaScript, right? So now all the browsers have their own version of JavaScript. Then what happens, right? You can't develop websites for all different languages, making using all different languages, right? So what they did is there is a non-profit organization called European Computer Manufacturers Association. It's a pretty long name, but what they did is they took JavaScript and they standardized it, to have a standard of JavaScript that can work in all the browsers. So if you develop JavaScript using ECMAScript, then you can run those websites in all those browsers. So that's the point. Well, in these days, ECMAScript and JavaScript are used interchangeably. So each year we have ES, that is ECMAScript. They release a new version of JavaScript. They just put on new features like each year they put it on. So the latest one is ES 2020. If you can, so that makes sense, right? Last year. ES 2021 will come up probably in June this year, I guess. So that's your ECMAScript, which is also like JavaScript, but they call it as a standard for JavaScript. It is, you can use it interchangeably in these days. All right, so let's start off with JavaScript, the basics of JavaScript. We'll start off with data types, right? So we have 6 primitive data types. We have numbers, we have strings, we have booleans, and then we have something called a symbol. We'll get to that. So in JavaScript, we have a number, and if you see other languages, right, we have something called integers, we have floats, we have doubles, but here it's just all put together into one single, a data type called number. So if I say, you can just open your console in a new tab, you can just right click and you can say inspect, which will open this. You can go to your console and try it out, right? You can say 1 plus 2 gives 3, and at the same time 12 by 5 will give you 2.4. So it's all the same number, right? It's the same number, but it can have variable. It can be a decimal or an integer. It can be float, double, long, everything. So moving on, our next data type is string. So for string, you'll be using a quote, just like all other languages. Say we have hello. So that's a string. You can use single quotes. We can have double quotes. Something new in JavaScript is you can use back quotes. All right. Now, in order to store these values, right, we'll be using variables. So variables will store your values and you can reuse it. So to use variables, we don't use, again, in JavaScript, we don't use types. That is something called dynamic typing in JavaScript. You just declare a variable like variable name equals, say I have Sri Charan, right? So my name is, if I say name, I get my name right back. So in your now in JavaScript, your variables don't have a particular data type. So I can just say name equals 2. So my name is changed to 2 again. So that's the thing, right? You can't really change your, you can have different data types allocated to it. Now, for moving on to coming back to strings, JavaScript allows for dynamic programming. So what you can do is, when you use your backtick, you can do something like hello, and then you put on your dollar symbol, you put 2 braces, and then you say name. Let's see what we get, right? So hello 2. Initially, if we had the name to be, say, Vicharan, and then you can use your up arrows to get your previous commands. So if I run that again, I get hello Srijan. So that's dynamic, right? Dynamic programming in JavaScript. So those are your strings, and then you have your booleans, which store true and false values. And then you have something called symbol. This symbol actually came in ES 2015. We call it as ES6. So it was introduced in 2015. Now, what is symbol? We have different types. Actually, we have numbers, we have strings, we have booleans, but why do we need a symbol then? Well, symbol, you have some. So when you say symbol, right? So when I say a symbol, I get something like a symbol, right? Symbol is a data type. It gives you a unique value every time. Okay. So you can't really check the value of a symbol because in the backend, your symbol will be a huge number. So all the need for a symbol is you get a unique value every time you call the symbol constructor, right? And then moving on to undefined and null. Okay, so undefined, we have undefined, we have null. Well, technically speaking, both are the same. They both say that your variable does not have a value. So then why do we need two separate data types? We have like null, we have like undefined. Let's check that out. Okay. So null is an object, whereas undefined is a type of itself. So undefined is a type, but null here is an object. Now, what is the difference between null and undefined? So undefined says that the variable does not even exist. So when you run your JavaScript code and you have a variable which you haven't given any value to, according to JavaScript, your variable does not exist. But when you say null, you have to explicitly tell that the variable is null. When you do that, you give a value to JavaScript. So your JavaScript knows that the variable exists, but it does not have a value. So let's take an example. We have undefined, right? So I say undefined plus one. So undefined does not have a value, it does not exist. So plus one, I give not a number, right? NaN stands for not a number because undefined is not a number. But similarly, if I give null plus one, I get back one because when you say undefined, it does not exist. So not a number. Null can take up values according to your arithmetic operation. So in this case, it goes for zero, right? So that's the difference between your null and undefined data types. We'll come back to objects and arrays a bit later in the session. So we'll move on to control flow statements and looping statements. These are the same as all the other languages you would have learned in your high school, like C++, Python, or Java. So we have if else, we have if else if. So what these are control flow statements, right? Now, one important thing here to note is that when you are using your if statements, so let me open my VS Code over here. So I have my index.js file over here. Now what I'm going to do is, let me say I have a variable called name, right? I have a name called Sricharan. Now I want to check if the name equals Sricharan, right? Now what I do is I do it like this. So this is what happens in, so I then say console.log, I give hello. So what happens here is you can't give double equals. In JavaScript, there is a difference between double equals and triple equals. So what happens now is that let me give you a more simple example, right? I have 2 and then I have double equals, say 2. It gives me true. Why is that? Because we have 2 as a number and then we have 2 as a string. That is not right. So what double equals does is that it converts the type. It just checks the value. So 2 is equal to 2. That is true. But when I say triple equals, it gives me false. So keep that in mind whenever you're typing, trying to check something, checking for equality, make sure that you use triple equals. So that will also check your data type, or else you'll get an error. You'll have a few bugs in your code. So then you have switch statements, switch cases where you pass on a variable and then you have separate cases. And then ternary operator. Ternary operator is really important. You'll have a use of it for a lot of time in your JavaScript development. And then we have looping statements. We have for, while, do, while, right? So again, speaking about JavaScript, you can't really have a data type, right? So in usually what you use in C++, you say int I equals 0, I less than 10, and then I plus plus, right? Here you can't say int. Instead, you have to say variable, right? You have to say variable, and then you can say console.log, and then you give I. So what happens when you do that? Let me go to my. So if I refresh, I get 0 to 9, right? So that's my console log. Make sure you use variable and not data types. That's the difference in JavaScript. It's called, again, remember dynamic typing. You can't explicitly specify a data type. It can keep varying. Now that's your for looping statements. These are all, they have the same syntax in your as compared to your other languages. All right. So moving on, we have functions. Okay, so functions, as you know, they are used to, put code inside a put code inside a block that you can use repeatedly, right? If you want to add two numbers, then if you put it inside a particular function, you can call that function and just pass on the numbers. You don't have to write the syntax, write the code for adding two numbers again and again. So in JavaScript, we have something interesting over here. So this is your traditional way to define a function, right? Just like all other programming languages, you have the keyword function, you have the name of the function, and then you pass the parameters and all the code that you need to run in the function. Now we have something called anonymous function in JavaScript. So this is called an anonymous function. So if I remove this for now, so this is function parameter and my brackets, right? My code. Now I can't call this in any way because I don't have a name for it, right? So what I do is I pass the function, I assign the function to a variable, right? So now that we have anonymous functions, we'll use a lot of we'll use anonymous functions in a lot of places. So what they did is, instead of using the word keyword function, they in ES6 in ES 2015 they introduced something called arrow functions. Basically, it's a new syntax to define your functions. Instead of writing the keyword function, you can just pass on this equal to and greater than symbol. That will do everything. And if you want the example, you can also say parameter. You can also pass parameters to it. Now, another important thing to remember in JavaScript, again, you do not give data types. So you won't be using something like int p2, or you won't be using var p2 is just p2. So remember that again. We'll be using the p2 directly. JavaScript has the ability to recognize that it's a parameter to the function. Okay, so var versus let versus count. Okay, what is that? We have var. You know what var is? It is used to tell what a variable is. But what is let and what is const? Now, var has a technical issue in JavaScript. I'll tell you what that is. So in ES 2015, they introduced two new methods, two new syntaxes of defining variables. So one is let and the other is const. Const is pretty obvious, right? Const means constant. So if you define a variable using const, you can't reassign it. So what is let in this case? Well, I put this slide over here because it's important to know what, if you read this line, it says var has a functional scope. Now, what does a functional scope mean? Let me give you an example. So let me say I'll be using arrow functions from now on. So I have say const add, or I can say as, or as an arithmetic sum. So I can pass in a number and then my arrow functions. Now what I'll do is I'll have a for loop. So I'll say var I equal to 0, I less than num, and then I have I plus plus, and then I'll say console.log I, right? So what do you think would happen over here? We have a console log from 0 to num, right? So if I say is of 4, then I'll get, okay, one second, let me refresh this page. So I say is of 4, and then I get 0, 1, 2, 3, right? But here's the thing. What do I now in other programming languages, when you use say when you declare the variable inside I, you won't be able to access it outside that block for loop, right? So if I do console.log of I over here, what should I get? I should get like something like undefined, right? So let's check it out. What happens is when I say as of 4 again, I get 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Wait, how is that possible? So 0, 1, 2, 3, we got it from the for loop, but then this console log also works. How is that possible? We cannot. Your variable I should not be it should not be accessible outside the for loop, right? That's what all the other programming languages have in common. Then this is one case of errors, right? Now this is simple code, so you can rename the variable when you're using it again. But when you have very complex code, you might tend to reuse the variable names, right? In that case, your variables will be overwritten. So the problem here is var has something called functional scope. So var, if I say var I, then I'm declaring the variable for the outer function, right? The entire function, and not the enclosing block, right? I'm not using it just for the for loop. I'll have it for the whole function. Now instead, if I use let, then let's see what happens. So if I refresh and I say as of 4, I get 1, 2, 3, and I is not defined. I have an error. I is not defined, right? So that is the advantage of let. So that error where variable defined using var is accessible outside the block is now not accessible using let. So I would recommend you to start using let instead of var. I'll be doing the same for the rest of the session. So this is pretty important. So remember not to use var anymore. And moving on, we'll come back to arrays. Now arrays are something different in JavaScript. Usually in all other languages, if you say arrays you can say array of strings, an array of numbers, an array of say boolean values. Here you can have a mixture of all the data types. Again, JavaScript has dynamic typing. You can't really define a type in JavaScript. So it can have multiple values and it will have multiple data types also. And these are two separate ways you can define an array. You can go on with this one if it's comfortable to you. So that's arrays, right? Now, these are some array methods that are really useful. Okay. So throughout your programming experience, you would have used if you need to iterate through arrays, you would use a for loop or a while loop, right? So those are like 3, 4 lines. Instead, we have these array methods that would do the iteration in a single line. Say I have an array, say ARR, which has a few numbers, say 21, 53, 100, and 64, and 5. Let's consider this, right? Now, say I want to find the length of the array. Length is pretty simple, right? I'll just show you a few methods. These are not all the methods. These are some of the most important used methods. I'll just show you a few of them. So in my document, if I say arr.length, then I get 5, right? So that is pretty simple. Now, what do I do if I need to iterate through each array? Then I say array.for each. So for each, we need to use something. We need to use the anonymous function over here. If you remember what I told you about anonymous functions, you can just declare this part. You don't need to give it a name because it will directly start executing. That is something called a callback function. We'll get to that later. So we have an array, right? So inside this callback function, we'll pass something called we'll pass a parameter. Say we have element, and then we open the array, and then we can just say console.log of element, right? So we can use that. So what do we get? We get all the elements back, right? So instead of using a for loop and defining a variable like let I equal 0, I less than arr.length of, this does it to you in just one single line, right? So here you don't necessarily need to pass the name. Element is just a parameter to the function, so I can just say e also, and it would still work. So I have e. I'm printing. So what happens is the for each runs this function every time, and it passes these array elements into this function, right? So that's what's happening. So this is for each is a function. It passes the values of the function each time. So that's what's happening. And what else? What other array methods do we have? We have something called a filter. So say I want to filter out an array out of the array, I just want to filter out, numbers that are greater than 50, for example. So how do I do that? Usually in normal programming languages, you would be like for int I equal to 0, and then you'll put a looping if a conditional statement inside it, if I element ARR of I is greater than 50. So that is pretty long, right? So instead, what you can do is you can just say filter, and then again pass in a function with a parameter e, and then what happens is you need to return an expression where this element where this value will return out to be true. So when I say e greater than 50, right? So what happens is when I say e is greater than 50, it will check if that e is greater than 50, and it will say if it's true or false, right? Because this is what is this? This is an equal expression, right? This is a Boolean expression, so it will return either true or false. Say, for example, for 21, it will return true. For 53, it will return false. So what happens is if I get true, right? If the function returns true to filter, then it will spit out that part. So when I say array.filter and then I pass e is greater than 50, what do I get? Okay, so we miss a parenthesis, and I get 5364, right? So what happens is it passes on the elements again. The filter function will pass on the elements to this function, this anonymous function, and then it will say check if 21 is greater than 50 or 53 is greater than 50. If it is true, then spit out the value, right? Or else you just let it go, skip to your next iteration. What else do we have? We have sort. All right, so sort is pretty interesting in JavaScript. Now we have this array, right? So array dot, if I give sort of, pretty simple, right? This is what happens in all of your programming languages. In your C++, you give sort of. But what is this? This is wrong, right? We get 100, 21, 5, 53, and 64. How is that happening? Again, the culprit is dynamic typing. It converts your numbers into strings and then it sorts the function. So how do I sort numbers? For that, you need to say, so keep this in your mind, guys. This is pretty important. You might have to use this later. So I have to pass in two numbers. So because in order to sort, you have to compare if two numbers of an array are equal, greater than, or lesser than, right? So this function, this anonymous function that I use, what I need to do is I need to return a negative number, 0 or positive number. So what happens is I have A and then I have B. So when I perform an operation, an arithmetic operation, so say for example I say return A minus B, right? So what happens is when I say A minus so when I say A minus B, what happens is I'll get a value, right? Say I have 21 minus 5, so I'll get a positive value. I have 5 minus 53, I'll get a negative value, right? So when I get a negative value, it means A is greater than B, swap it. When I get a positive value, which means A minus B is a positive value, which means A is greater than B, so we need to swap it. If it's a negative value, we don't need to swap it, we can keep it as it is. So that's what it is. So when I say all right, again I forgot to give the parentheses, sorry for that. Now it works correctly, right? We have 5, 21, 53, 64 and 100. Previously we had 100 and then 21, because according to strings 1 comes before 2, right? So keep this in mind. You might need this later on when you move on to using JavaScript. So that these are your some important methods, array methods, that you need to keep in mind. And what else do we have? All right, so we'll move on to the next data structure, objects. Now this is very, very important, guys. So your objects, most of your JavaScript is actually objects only. So technically your array is an object. Let me tell you what I mean. So objects are named values, like key value pairs. So I have a key, say first name, and I have a value for it, John. I have a last name, I have a value for it, Doe. and then I have an ID, its value is 556. Objects can also store functions. So I have full name, and then I have a function that returns first name plus last name, concatenation of strings, right? Now, important thing is you need to focus on this keyword. Now, this keyword says that the first name belongs to the same object. The same, so this actually points to this person. So that the person variable, so that is the owner of this first name variable, right? Inside the property, the first name property. So when I have person, say I'll just copy this object over here. I'll copy it and I'll paste it in my I'll just clear out the console for now. I'll paste it, right? So I have person, I get an object back, right? So now what do you see over here? We have first name, a key, and we get a value John. We have full name, we have a function, we have ID 5566, we have last name Doe. Right. So let's print out array also. Now what happens over here is, check this out. This is really interesting. What do you see over here? You see a similar syntax, right? First name John, we have 0 and 5. We have ID 5566, we have 121 to 53. So array is also an object. So we can say the same for strings, because if you can remember, I told you that in objects we can also have functions. So similarly, your arrays have also functions, right? I told you about these array methods: length, for each, map, filter, reduce, every. So array is also an object. Can you think of any other data type that also has methods like this? Anybody? If you can put it in the chat. YouTube or Teams, anybody. We can just. Can you think of any data type, any other data type that also has methods? Strings, right? Strings. So strings, you can convert strings to uppercase, you can convert them to lowercase, and then you can get a substring out of the strings. So that is also an object. That's right. So we have, then we'll move on to classes. All right. Now in other languages, usually it's the other way around. We teach you classes and then we move on to objects. But in this case, we have objects which these classes are a template for the objects. It's not like classes and then objects are, because we use objects almost everywhere, right? So these classes actually just define a template to your object. So we have this new class, say class car, and then we have constructor function. So what does the constructor function do? It just gives your default value to your class variables, right? So class variables, or you can call them properties of your class. And so moving on, I have a small task for you guys. We have an array of objects. Now, what I want to do with, not what I want you guys to do is, I want you to take, I'll just put this on in the Teams chat. And so you can take this array of objects, and what you can do is, you can say give a filter out the top salesmen which have sales greater than 50,000, right? So if you want, you can just code along. Anybody can just put it in your chat. What function would you use and how would you define the function? So if you remember, we learned these array methods which will use to get out these objects, but then we need to compare properties of a particular property of these objects, right? We don't need to compare the whole object. We don't really care about what the name of the object is. We just need to see if the sales is greater than 50,000, right? So keep those two things in mind. I'll give you a minute or two to get out the object. So I'll be checking the Teams and YouTube simultaneously. So you can give out what, just think about it. The question is pretty clear, right? You need to filter out the objects which have sales greater than 50,000. So just try that out. I'll give you a minute. All right, so Sai Teja has given an answer. Right. So that is exactly right. So we have salespersons, and then we use a dot filter, and then we pass on the person dot sales. So that is important, right? We don't just need to get out objects. We need to compare only a particular property of an object. So we have to use person dot sales. So that will return say 57,000, 63,000, or 4,000. And then we just compare, we just put it in a Boolean expression greater than 50,000. If it turns out to be true, it will return that value, it will spit out that value, else it will skip, it will move on to the next iteration. So that's right, Saiteja. All right, so that comes to, we have come to an end to the basics of JavaScript. You know, JavaScript, that's common to all the other programming languages. So we'll move on to something a bit more advanced. We have asynchronous JavaScript. Okay, let me slow a bit down. In order to explain asynchronous JavaScript, let me explain what synchronous JavaScript is. So JavaScript is a single-threaded language. Don't get confused by that. It's not too complicated. Single thread, you can just assume, you know, a daily life example, like you're trying to make a necklace. So what do? You take a single thread and then you put on a bead one by one, right? You can't just put multiple beads at the same time, right? You just put a bead one by one into the thread. So that's exactly what's happening with JavaScript. So each line of your, if it's a bit confusing to you still, you can think of it. You can, as you know, JavaScript is that interpreted language, right? So what does an interpreted language do? It combines so it takes the value. So what happens is it takes a particular line of code, executes that, it moves on to the next line of code, it executes that, and then it takes line by line, right? So what is compilation? It takes whole code, compiles it, and then executes it. So that's what single-threaded language is. Now, what is the drawback of single-threaded language like asynchronous JavaScript? Why do we need asynchronous JavaScript? Let's just take this example for a second, right? So we have say 4 independent tasks and 4 independent functions, you can assume. So when I call these functions, say function 1 executes, and then function 2, and then function 3, and then function 4. So function 1 takes 20 seconds, 7 seconds, 10 seconds, 8 seconds. So for all these functions to complete, we need 45 seconds. And in computer science, that is a very long time, right? So what I can do is, if they are independent tasks, I want them to execute simultaneously, right, at the same time. So this takes 20 seconds, this takes 7 seconds, 10 seconds, 8 seconds. It all takes place in one particular time. It starts at the same time, right? So total I have 20 seconds because the first thing takes 20 seconds. Now, coming back, Java is again a single-threaded language. You cannot execute multiple statements at the same time. Then how do you make it asynchronous? That is the question, right? So for that, we have something called callbacks. If you remember, I told you about callback functions. Basically, you're passing an anonymous function to another function. That is a callback function. So, I mean, think about it. Think about it in your biblical term, right? Callback function. After you finish your function, just call me back. That's what it means, right? Callback. Take a real life example, like you go. Only if you order your food, you can eat your food, right? So callback is like only if you get your food. I mean, only if you get your food and then you start eating your food. So you have to wait until you eat your food, right? So what happens is, let me give you a example of say I have a website and I want to display some images onto that website. So what do I do in that case? What I would do is I'd get the images from my server and then I'll display those images to my website. So we have 2 separate functions, right? Now, in order to execute them, we'll first get the images from the server. Now that might take some time, right? As I told you, 10 seconds, 7 seconds, even 1 or 2 seconds is quite a bit long because usually programming languages run in nanoseconds or milliseconds. So a second is like 1,000 milliseconds, right? So that is a long time. So how do I make sure that my code doesn't get stuck up. This is called blocking code. So what happens is I want to display my images. So until I get my images from my server, I have to stop all of my JavaScript code. I can't run any other function on the side. So how do I resolve this? So if you take this diagram, for example, we have a statement, then this statement is like, consider this to be getting some data from your database. Now what happens? This takes time, right? Now these two are these two are independent tasks that you need to run, but how will you run them? Statement 2 has stuck up your code, or it takes time to execute. Now what I can do is I can have something called a callback function. So while this statement 2 takes time, what I would say to JavaScript is you start running statement 3 and statement 4, and after you return the data, and then you print my images, right? So I have statement 2, consider that to be getting images from your data, and my callback is something that would print my image, like render my images to my website. So I don't want to wait until I get my data from my server. So I'll just tell them, you start running all the other functions that are in my queue to run. We do not want to stop the code. So this is what is the use of a callback. Now we've learned a bit of this theory. We'll just see how this works in JavaScript, right? So I have something called a callback. All right, so what I can do is, let me take a function, say login, right? Login, and again I'll use my arrow keys. Now I'll pass in a parameter, say email, and then I'll say password. Okay. So what I need to do is, after I get my email and password, let's use something called a set timeout. So what happens is, whatever happens inside a set timeout will happen after a particular second. Say again, as I told you, JavaScript programming languages run in milliseconds. So if I need to, what happens is, in set timeout, whatever function runs inside this part will be delayed after a particular number of seconds that we define. Say I say 3000, right? See, so 3000 is like 3000 milliseconds, which converts to 3 seconds, right? So whatever is inside this set timeout will run after 3 seconds. So what I can say is, after I get my login, after I say log my information in, I'll say return so I'll tell them to return an object which has my username as the same as email. So let's just try this out. I'll just give you a simple example of, I'll just give you a referral. So we have start, and then we have console.log end. All right, so we want this whole function to run before the start and after start and before end. So here what we'll do is, we'll say const user equals, we'll call the login function because it returns something to us. So I'll say login of abc@gmail.com, and then I have abc. All right, so well, it's not a safe password, but that is another discussion. And we'll console log this user over here. So what do you think would happen now? Anybody would like to guess, like, what would be the printing order of like, if I run this function, what would be printed? Anybody would like to guess? Teams or YouTube? You can just put it in your chat. I'll just check it out, and then I'll give you a minute or two. You can just give me an example of what would happen. Like, say I have, just tell me what would be printed eventually. So I say I have start, and then I have call this function login, so which will return my email. So we'll be printing email over here, and then end. So what do you think will happen? Let's try that out. Okay. So let's just clear this and let me refresh this. Wait, what just happened over here? what you would have expected is you would have expected start, and then you would have gotten your abc at gmail.com, and then you would have gotten your end, right? But you got something called undefined. Now, if you remember what undefined is, that does not exist. So it just says that your user variable is, it does not exist. Now, why is that? Now, again, if you remember your callbacks, what happens is I called my login function and I ran my console log over here. Now, this console log is like another statement, right? Think of it as a thread. So the first statement in your thread is start. The second statement in your thread is login. The third statement in your thread is console log this user, and the fourth statement in your thread is end. Now, I want this console log user to run after I get this login function, after I get my login details, right? So how would I do that? So for that, we have something called the callback function. So what I do is in my function, I define something like callback. Now this callback is a function. So what I want to do is I want to run my callback function after I get my data, right? So this set timeout says that I get my data after 3 seconds. So I'll just say callback, and then I'll pass in the function, right? So I'll just pass whatever data I want to run inside the, whatever I want to do with the data will be passed on to my callback. So in here again, we have to give the callback variable a function. So I'll use an anonymous function for that. In this, I'll pass something called a user. Now, what happens is I have called a callback, right? And I have passed a parameter, I have passed an object. Now, usually when you write your functions in programming language, you just assume that you get something called a user. So here I'll just say console log user, all right? You can also consider this to be user one if it's confusing to you. So I have user over here. Let's just try and see what happens, all right? So I'll refresh over here. I have start, I have end, and then 3 seconds later, I have my username. I do not have undefined. So what's happening? What's happening over here? So I have my start, and then I have my function running. But what's happening is my login is running, right? So when my login runs, and JavaScript understands that this is a callback function. So callback function will run after I get my data. So JavaScript says, okay, fine, you can run this console log dot end. When I get my data, I'll just console log this user. That is, I'll run this function. So that is your callback. So what happens is you get your data, you don't get undefined. So that is something really useful, right? When you move on to web development or app development, this will be useful in the case that when you're fetching something from your server, it will take some time. This I've just mimicked this function using a set timeout, but generally it will have like a second or 2 seconds delay. So you need to have a callback instead of directly console logging the value, right? So keep that in mind. And then we have something called, all right, but just before moving on to promise, I'll just tell you what seems pretty simple, right? This is pretty simple. You have a login, you have a callback function, and then it all runs pretty smoothly. Now we have something like this. Where if you have a more complex code, what happens is, so let me just comment this out for now. So look at this. I have start, and then I have a login function. I have get images. I have get image details, and then I've called the callback over here. So let me just explain what is happening. So I'm calling the login function. I'm logging the user in using his email and his password. So that will return my user credentials. That is my username. And then with that, what I want to do is I want to get the user's images. So what I do is I'll call get images, right? I'll call get images, and I'll pass on the username of the user, and he will return my images, array of images, and then say I want the title of the image to be returned. So what I do is I pass the image, and then I return the title, right? So look at this. This is unreadable, right? It is pretty well, you cannot understand it in your first go, right? So if you're looking at somebody's code and you see this, it is pretty overwhelming, right? So you have login, you have a callback. Inside that callback, you have another function for which you have a callback. Inside that callback, you have another function which has another callback. So you're nesting your callbacks, right? So it just stacks up, right? It doesn't look good. This is something we called as callback hell. So to make it look more understandable, more easier, we have something like we have something called a promise. Now it might, if you feel like I'm going a bit fast, I'll just slow it down. I'll just tell you what a promise is. Take a real life example again. So your mom asks you to clean your room after dinner. So what do? You just say, okay, I promise I'll do it, right? You're giving her a promise that you'll finish a function, like you will finish a particular task. Now it is up to you that you finish it successfully or you don't. So what happens in promises? Uh, in JavaScript, we have the word promise. So that's the advantage of using English words, right? So promise makes sense. So JavaScript will be like, promise me that you'll return my images, and what if the server successfully returns or not? That's a totally different issue. I'm just telling JavaScript that you just give me my images, and if you successfully give me my images, then I'll have something called resolve. If you don't give me my images successfully, I have like reject. So technically we have two callbacks for promise. In your real life example, it would be like you promise your mom that you'll clean your room after dinner, but then if you clean your room, she'll give you like a dessert or an ice cream or something. If you don't clean your room, you won't get your dessert or you won't get an ice cream. So you need two functions here, right? So error handling also happens at the same time. So you pass on two callbacks. One is resolve, the the callback function that runs after you get your images successfully, and then we pass a function called reject. What happens here is the when my fetch fails, when the function fails, my code will have an error, right? I can't do anything with it. The data is not usable. So I use something like a promise. So I'll just show you how promise works. Bear with me for a second. So in JavaScript, um, you have something, your promise looks something like this. I'll just cut this out for a second. So in order to define your promise, you have a new keyword and then you use your promise. So what is this actually? Now promise is a JavaScript object, right? Like I told you, almost everything in your JavaScript is objects only. So meaning it has properties and methods. So what you're passing to is a callback function which has two callbacks. We have to pass two callbacks. Remember, not just one. We have to pass two callbacks. So we have resolve and then reject. So let's just say my function is again to return my username. In this case, I'm returning say ABC. Now, how do you use? Okay, I've defined a promise. How do I use it? So, what was the purpose of this promise? If you remember, to make this more readable, right? To make this callback hell, this ugly nested pyramid-like structure, to make it more readable, right? So, what I'll do is, let me comment this out. So, I'll call promise, and then what I'll do is I'll use something called dot then. Now, you can easily read it like an English statement, right? You run the promise and then what I would do. So you have something called a then, and then what happens is you're returning a promise, right? You're returning a promise. This promise returns your username, right? So we need to pass in the user parameter over here, and then let's say I'm console.logging user. All right. So let's just try this out. Let's see what happens. So when I refresh, I get start, I get end, and then I get user ABC. It's the same thing, right? It's the same thing that happened before in your callback. Now, this looks pretty easy to read, right? This looks pretty easy to read. Dot then if I say if I've resolved my error, and then I have something like dot catch. Now we've written dot then for successful return of our data, right? Now what if our server hasn't returned a proper data to us, data that is not usable, or it hasn't returned any data? So we have to send some reject, right? We have to say that it has rejected my data. So what I would do is I'll say reject, and then in JavaScript again you have a new you pass something called an error, right? Remember this. This might be pretty useful. So you have something called an error. Error is again an object which has a message property. So we'll pass a message such that user not available, right? So if I catch this, so what I need to do is I have to catch this error, and then I'll console log it, console.err, and then error, right? So let's try what happens over here. So what's happening? I have my start, I have my end. Oh, all right. So this is not ERR. This is error, right? So let's run it again. So I have my start, I have my end. Then I'm getting an error. User is not available, right? So that is your advantage of using a promise. It handles your error and it gives you a more readable syntax, right? So you return a promise and then you use dot then dot catch. Now again, this is pretty simple, right? This is pretty simple. You just need to run one function. But I want to how does that work in this case? So let's just comment this function out for a second, and then we'll try to refactor this code. So let's just cut this one out, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a new promise over here. So if you can see, I have a so I'll just cut this callback over here. I'll cut this callback. I'll cut this callback because your promise does not need a callback. So we have say resolve, and then we have resolve, and then we have resolve. All right. So let's just concentrate on this for now. So what's happening over here? I have my login function and I'm passing it email and password. Now I'll check, like in this place I'll have some code that would check if my email and password is right. And then I'm promising JavaScript that I'll return your user credentials again. So I'll say I'll use that set timeout again to make your server returning it after 3 seconds. So I'll say resolve username email. So what happens is I'm getting my email back. I'm getting my user credentials after successful login, right? Same thing goes for get images. What happens is I'm returning a promise. I'm telling that okay, you've given me your username and you want your images. I'll promise you that I'll return your images. So if the server successfully returns it, I say resolve, and then I pass on the data, and then same for get image details, right? You asked me for the title of an image. I've gotten your image. I'll promise you that I'll return the title of the image successfully, right? So I have to return a new promise that has resolve and reject callback, and then I have a set timeout, to mimic the function of what is happening when I get my details, right? So all right, we've gotten to that part, but what's important is I want to remove. I'll just what I'll do is I'll comment this part out. We'll compare our functions later on. All right. So we'll just remove this for now. We'll remove remove this, and then we can have resolve. We'll have resolve. All right. So we have our promises ready, but how do I call those promises? So let's say I have login. I'm calling in login, and I'll pass in again abc@gmail.com. And then what else am I passing? I'm passing abc. I'm passing my password, right? So I've passed on my data to the server. Now what it does is it returns a promise. So how do I handle the promise? I use dot then, right? If you remember. So according to the promise will return a username. So I'll say user, and then what am I going to do with that? I'll just console log the user for now. And then what do I want after the user? I want to get my images from the server, right? So what I do is, if you remember over here, we have console log and then we called get images, right? Again, we'll do the same thing over here. So we have get images and then we'll pass user dot username. So now what happens over here? What happens next? Now what is get images return? Get images returns another promise, right? It returns another promise. Now how do we handle that? What we can do is we can say dot then again. So you have logged in and then you've given me a promise that you will return my user. With that, I will get my images. So when I'm asking for images, the server promises me again that it will return my images. So what I can say is I have then, and then I'll have console.log images. And then what do I do next according to this callback help? I get my image details, right? So I pass on get image details and then I say images of 0. So I want just the first title of the first image. Now again, this what does get images return? It returns a promise, right? Can one of you try what the next statement to be would be? How would I handle this get images? How would I print my image title? Can one of you just put it in the chat here or in YouTube? One of you can just try, using the next dot then statement. It's pretty simple. I just want to. I've just gotten my image. I'm just asking my server to give me my images. Server promises that it will give me an image. It will give me the title of the image, right? So what I would do is now this again. Let's follow this pattern over here. So I have called get images over here, and then I have used dot then, right? So I'll use that again. I'll use dot then. I have details. Say it gives me details, right? So I'll just say details, and then I'll console.log details over here. Details. All right. So this is our promise, and then what else do? We have to say dot catch, right? If in case my server does not keep up its promise, we need to handle that error also. So we say console dot error and then we pass on error, right? So we have our we have our promise successfully handling, and then if there is an error, what happens? Let's just try it out, right? We'll try it out again. What happens? We have start, we have end. Again, remember this is asynchronous. So what happens? We have start runs first and then end runs first, end runs and then our asynchronous function runs, right? So let's just check what happens over here. Okay, so we are getting an error over here. So what is the error? Right. So we have called user, we have got get images, and we have set timeout, we are resolving images. We have images, get image details, right? So we have get images, we pass in username. So we resolve it with an array. I think we have. All right, maybe I should. So we have this, we have that. I'll just console log it. I will just comment this out for a second now. We'll just refresh and see what happens. I cannot read zero property of undefined. So it's returning undefined. What happened over here? I have get images. Let's just say I have user. I'll just pass on user. Let's try what happens now. Right. So we are getting an error. What is the error? So we have that. We have images, and then we are trying to console log images, and then we are getting. We'll just try to use images again. But we should get images. Are we using this right? So we have get images. So 1 second. Sorry for this. Um, right. So what happens over here? What happens over here is, so just take this out for now. So what we can do is, we can say reject. Let's try what happens over here. Right. So we have our start, we have our end. Right. So what is happening? On called promise, we have images. We are returning the images, but the problem is, what is the problem? We'll resolve it again. Right. So we are getting data, right? So what happens is we are calling my login, we are calling the dot then because it returns us a promise. And then with that promise, we are calling another function which returns a promise. We have to handle that promise with a dot then. We have to handle this promise with a dot then. And then finally we use the dot catch error, right? So what happens over here is how better does it look to read this, right? We have login and then we have dot then, we have dot then, we have dot then. Compared to this callback help, it's not readable, right? So this is console.log user, we have get images, and then we have again another callback. This nested doesn't look right, right? But here comes the problem. Now, if you are new to JavaScript, your promise dot then and then you have dot catch, it might look a bit weird to understand in the first place. So what we can do is we have something called async await. So what happens over here is now we have our promise like this. We can make it a bit more. We can write this in a bit more conventional syntax. So we can say I have a function called get data. Take that for an example. And then what I do is I just take the user information, right? So I say login, and then I say user, and I pass on. All right, this was abc@gmail.com. Then I have abc, right? Now, what do I do here is, this is actually JavaScript reads this as a synchronous data, right? We have promise which JavaScript understands as um, uh, uh, asynchronous, but how does JavaScript understand a normal defined function? So what we do is we pass on something called a keyword called async, and then we say that await. Now what happens over here is we are telling JavaScript that this function is an asynchronous function, that whatever happens inside actually it returns a promise, right? So what I'm doing with await is I'm actually taking up the promise and then I'm returning whatever's happening inside. So I have await login over here, and then I need const images, which I can say by await get images, and then I pass on user, right? And then what do I do with these images? I need const details. We use await. So for that we need get image details. We pass on images of 0 or something like that. So this looks pretty interesting. It looks conventional, right? It looks conventional to read other compared to the previously dot then dot catch and returning a promise and everything. So let's try to console.log all of our data over here. We have user, and then after I'm running my images, I get my console.log images, and then after I get my images, I pass on the function. So I try to console log details. So what's happening over here? Now, until I get my login, right, all of this won't start working. So that's what we mean by asynchronous. This is what we mean by callback, right? Until this promise is fulfilled, this this returns my username. I will not use it. I will not move on to the next thing, right? So that's what's happening over here. So let's try that. So we have our start, end, our reference, console logs, which happens at the end. Our console logs, these didn't happen because it's still waiting to get the data. And then what happens is you will get your, you'll be console logging your data. How better does it look to, read these, right? So you have these, and then that is your asynchronous JavaScript, all right? So this is really useful when you move on to your web development or your app development. So as this says, it allows us to write promises in a better and understandable syntax, right? More conventional syntax, because again, JavaScript developers have thought about that too, writing promises, the dot then and dot catch. But again, if this is if this is pretty confusing to you guys, you can go through this video again to see what's happening. But I would suggest that you use your dot then and you get familiarized with your dot then and dot catch. And then what happens is, well, you have just a meme for you guys. So why are asynchronous programmers so strong? Because we have a weight, right? A dumbbell, right? Just a broken humor for you guys. And then moving on to the most interesting topic of JavaScript, document object model. Now, what is a document object model? What do you mean by that? Now, let's see what a document is, right? So let's just clear this and let's just say what a document is. So what is a document? When I hover over the document, you can see that my page is being highlighted, right? So that's exactly it. My document is actually my HTML over here. So what was the purpose? If you remember the story, what was the purpose of JavaScript? You want me to make the website more interactive, right? Listen to events, like we have buttons, we have input tags or text fields over here. I need to listen to those. So in order to make that, in order to use your HTML inside your JavaScript, we have something called document object model. Now, don't get confused over here. It's nothing basically. You've seen your HTML code over here, right? And what I'm doing is I'm just putting all that HTML code into a tree-like structure. That's what JavaScript does. So if you can see over here, I have a form, and then inside that I have a h1, I have a div. Inside the div, I have a label, input, and everything, right? So what happens is it puts that into a tree so that we can easily access them, right? So we have a document, we have HTML, we have head, title, my title, and then we have a body, we have a, and its attributes, right? Now, why am I calling this an object? Because document, as you see, is an object, right? It is an object with different methods and it has its own properties. So its properties are these are its properties. Let's take a more simpler example. So let's take this button, right? We have this button. Now I want to say that I have an input, say I have type button and then I have an ID. Now, how can I visualize this as an object? Now, if you remember your HTML, this input tag has a type, it has an ID, these attributes, right? In JavaScript, we can call those as properties. So my name is an attribute, value is an attribute, type is an attribute, my disabled is an attribute. So these attributes, you can consider them as properties, and then you will have your methods, right? Like on click and everything. So consider them as your properties and methods. So according to JavaScript, what are properties and methods? It eventually boils down to your object, right? So that is why they named it as document object model, because it's in this format. And then what? Okay, all right. So now we have seen what can be done with HTML. We have our DOM. Now what do we do with those? We can access my HTML, but what can I do with that? Now what we're going to see is something called selectors. Now what selector does is allows us to access those individual elements like my button. And so what is this document? This document has this entire structure, right? This document actually gives you this entire HTML code for me, but I want to say I want to access just one button or just this H1 tag. So what do? We use something called selector. So with these selectors are methods of document. So what happens is I have something called get element by tag name. So what is a tag in HTML? We have h1, we have a, we have input, we have div, all that, right? So when I say over here, so let me cut this all out. All right. So when I say I need to access my h1 tag, right? What do I do is, let's cut this out. And I'll say I have a let and I need say h1, right? So I'll say document dot get element by tag name, right? So I need to pass in what tag I need. So inside quotes I need to say h1, right? So let's save this. We'll go back over here and in console we'll try to console log this h1, right? So what are we getting? We have an h1, right? Now when I hover over this h1, you can see that I'm getting this this login form h1 is being highlighted, right? So I'm getting an array of h1. So that is your get element by tag name. And then you have get element by id. So what is the use of get element by id? Say I have my input tag and I have an id attribute to it. So email. So when I say let email be equal to document dot get element by id, then what do I say? I say email, right? So when I refresh this and I say I can console log email, right? So what do I get? I get this email tag, input tag, right? So these are some of your selectors, but probably the most used one would be get query selector, document.query selector. Because how do you use it is document.query selector lets you to select any type of so I can say I can have a tag h1 or I can select an ID using my hashtag, say hashtag email gives me my ID. If I want to select an element with its class name, I can say dot, say I have a class over here. I have a div over here which has a class email ID, right? So I can say dot email dot dash div, right? So this query selector allows us to select uh, any type of element using any of its attributes also. So that's query selector will use this most. Then what else? What else do we have? Now we know now how to access these elements, but what do we do with these elements? We need to manipulate it, right? That's the point of this section, DOM manipulation, right? So we can say I have, let's just choose h1, right? So I have my h1 and I have my h1 over here as login form. Let's just say I want to make it red. So what do I do? So my h1 by default does not have any uh, style. So what I'll do is I'll go to my index.js. I'll say h1 dot, and then I have to say style. So I have to say style, then I have to say dot color equals, say I have to say red, something like that. So when I set that to be true over here, all right, we can now read color of undefined. All right. So instead, what we can do is, so this is how we set, what do you call that? Styling properties. You can set style, you can set so we'll try it in our console over here. We can say document dot query selector, we have h1, right? So what do we need to do over here? We need to say we have style. Now in this style, see if you can check this out, this style has multiple properties, right? Style again is an object. Now I want to change the color of it. So what do I do is I say I want to set the color to be red. So what happens over here is it changes my color, right? So when I get a document dot query selector h1 dot style dot color to be red, right? Similarly, what I can do is I can change the color from. I can use the background also. So if I set the background to be yellow, what happens? It changes my background also, right? So this is how you use JavaScript to change your you can manipulate your HTML using your JavaScript. So similarly, you can access your class names, you can add classes, you can remove classes and all that. You have many more methods in this. So what else? What else do we have? Now we can manipulate these HTML elements, right? But what I want to do, how do I make it more interactive? I want to, I want to take this. I want the values of these elements, right? Something to do when my submit happens. So what do I do in that? So to do that, let's just get all the elements over here. Say I have button and I say document dot query selector. I have button and then I have let email equals, just copy this over here. Then I have email, right? Because my all right, this is hashtag email. Sorry for that. And then I have a password also, right? So I have a password which says document.query selector hashtag password. Now I have these values, but what do I just want to print my I just want to print my values of email and password when I click the button, right? So what do? We have something called events. So these are called events, right? My button clicking or whatever I press in my keyboard, or say so mouse enter mouse out is considered this to be a HTML event. When I move through this box and come out, that is mouse enter, and then come on, moving out is mouse out. So these events can be listened to in JavaScript. Now, if you remember your callbacks, these events are asynchronous again, because I cannot let JavaScript keep waiting for the event, right? I just, whenever the event happens, I just need the callback function to run. So again, so when I say button, how do I do it? Is I say button dot add event listener, right? Add event listener, and I say what event do I need for this button. When I click it, I'll pass on a anonymous function, and we pass something called event. So whatever event is happening over here, it records all the details of those events and passes on to your anonymous function. So what do I need to do? What do I do is I say email dot value, right? I say email dot value. And then I say I need to console log this statement, right? So I'll console log this statement, console dot log, and then I do console dot log password, right? Our password dot value. Now, what happens over here is let's just check what happens over here, right? So I give my details, I give my password, and I submit. Now, what happened all of a sudden? It refreshed the page, right? I don't want the refresh to happen. So what do is this event again is an object. So I say event.print default. What happens is by default, when you click a button, your page refreshes, it re-renders, right? So I don't want that to happen. So I say event.print default, and I want them to print these values, right? So, all right, I think there is one issue over here. Yeah, so let's comment this. And what we can do is we can refresh, and I say data, and then I give my password, and then when I submit them, I get my details, right? I get my details. Now, how does this submit happen? I'm clicking my button, so the event registers it. The event goes to my JavaScript. My JavaScript listens to this click event, and then what happens? I run this function, right? I run this callback function. So that is your document manipulation. Let's try something a bit more interesting. All right. So what we can do is let's just clear this out for a second. I'll just say I have a div and I'll give it a class. Say I say circle, and then let me close the div. All right. What shall we do with this? So in my index.css, I'll say dot class. I mean dot class. Sorry, it was circle, right? Circle. So let me give it a height of 100 pixels, and I'll give it a width of 100 pixels, and then what I'll do is I'll give it a border so we can see 1 pixel solid black, and then we'll give it a border radius of 50%. That will make the div a circle, right? So when I refresh this page, what happens is I get a circle. Now what I want you to do, what I want to do is whenever so let's cut this out. So let's get the circle into our JavaScript. I say document dot query selector. Now I've used a class, so I say dot circle. Now what I want to do is every time I move into this circle, I want a color to get into that circle, and every time I move out, I want the color to get out. So how do I do that? Let's think about it. So when I describe the task to you, what I said is I want to move into the circle, right? So what does that mean? We need to use, say we need to listen to a event. So we say add event listener, and then what is the event? Mouse enter, right? So I want whenever my mouse enters, I want something to happen. What is that something? So when I say I want the mouse to enter, I say circle dot style dot background. I'll say background color equals red, something like that, right? So now what happens? Think about what happens over here. So when I move my mouse into the circle, my circle should turn red, right? So let's give that a try. So we'll save this, we'll refresh. Now, what do you think would happen? It turns red, right? But it doesn't. But when I move out, nothing happens, right? So we need to make a event for that also. So when I say add event listener, so what was the event for that? Mouse out, right? So mouse out, and then what should I define? I should remove the background color, right? So what I need to do is I'll just paste this over here, and then I just tell it to be an empty string. So for I want it to be red, and then when I move it out, I don't want it to be anything. So when I refresh, I move it to be red, and then nothing, red and nothing, right? Let's try to make this a bit more complex, right? With what we've learned with today's session of JavaScript, let's use a bit more JavaScript to it, right? So I have something called a color array, and I'll define a few colors over here. So I have red, I have blue, I have yellow, and then I have what else? I can have green. Now what I want to do is I want every time I enter my mouse, I want a random color to be generated other than my red. So what can we do? So we need a random color, right? So let's just define it in a function. So let's just say const get random color, and we'll use the arrow functions over here again. Now what I want to do is I want to return a random color, right? So I have to make use of the array over here. Now how do I get something random from this? Now again, like I told you, JavaScript, everything is objects. So we have an inbuilt object called math, like all other programming languages. Now what math does is, say for example, if I want to get a random integer or random number, I say math dot random, right? So this is a function. I call this, every time I call this, I get a random value, right? But what happens is I'm getting a random number between 0 and 1. But how do I use this over here? I need to get a random value between 0 and the length of this array, right? But let's try that. Math dot random, and we multiply it with the length of the array, right? So we have color array dot length. So what happens over here? What do you think would happen? So let's just take this. Let's just save this for now, and I'll just copy this. So when I refresh, when I print this, what do you think would be the answer? I have 3.5, I have 3.9, I have 0.55, 2.58. But we need integers, right? That's again another issue with JavaScript. We have a number, we don't have integers or floats or doubles. So I need a separate integers, right? So what do I do is I call another math function called math.float. So what happens is it takes down to the nearest lesser integer. So let's try that. So I can say, I can call say get random color, right? I can call that function. I have red, I have yellow, I have red, and then blue. So we've gotten our random color. So now we'll set that to be get random color over here. Now let's see what happens. So every time I move in, I get a random color, right? But since we have lesser number of colors, our colors are repeating. So that's another, we've used a lot of JavaScript over here, right? We have used arrays, and then we have used inbuilt math object, and we have used our DOM manipulation, right? So let me give you another task for you to do. How can you make the background of this color as a linear gradient of two colors? Can anybody give that a try? So if you remember, linear gradient is a mixture between two colors, like it fades from one color into the other. So again, remember, you need to use these arrays. I just want you to change this part to give a linear gradient, right? So anybody can anybody give that a try? We can do, all right, we can try something like we need a random color, right? But what I need is this background color needs a string value, right? So what I can do is instead, I'll say I have let color 1 equals get random color, and then I'll say another color 2 as get random color again. So I have two colors now. How can I generate a linear gradient? Now I can't pass variables into a normal string. So if you remember your strings in the beginning of the session, we use something called backquotes where you can specify variables, right? So I need to say linear. So I have gradient of, and then I pass in the two colors, right? So how do I pass in variables? I say dollar and then my curly braces. Inside that, I can pass the values, say color 1, and then I put a dollar, and then I put color 2, right? So let's see what happens now. So let me refresh this, and if all right. So right. Okay, so you can't use background color for linear gradient. We'll use background, right? So let's refresh this, and you can see. I mean, it is a bit ugly because we haven't used a good shades, but you get it right now. You get solid colors because you get random colors, right? You get random colors. Now both of those random colors can turn out to be the same color, right? So you can do these. Now in this task, you almost used all of your JavaScript that you've learned previously, right? Now moving on, we have browser object model. Now all along what you did in your DOM was you could access only this white space, right? White space which is rendering my HTML. Now say I want to access my other browser functions. So I need say my browser's height, I need my browser's width. So I can use something called the window object. Now what's interesting is that when I print out window object, and I scroll down, I can see that my document itself is a child of this window object, right? So window document was not the actual parent over here. It was actually window. Window was a parent of document also, because document is just this rendering part, we need to get all of it, right? So let's use a few of those window elements, right? So you've heard of alert. So what happens with alert? So when in your console, you don't need to specify window. Usually, you can just say hello alert. Say we have DSC, right? So when I do that, I get access to my browser function like alert. What else? What else do we have? We have say open. What happens with open is, so I say window dot open. I can open any website in a new window or a new tab, if you may consider it. So we have say https://dscvit.com, right? So what happens is my dscvit.com has opened in another window, right? So you have access to all of these browser functions in using your window object. So this is pretty useful also. And then we've come to the end of our session almost. We've reached our end. So we've learned JavaScript, right? So let's just take a recap of what we've learned. We've learned the basics. We've learned data types and data structures like numbers, symbols, strings, and then we have learned arrays and objects. We've learned this important concept of what is var versus let versus const and how we can avoid bugs. And then we've learned conditional and looping statements. We've learned functions. And then moving on, we learned asynchronous JavaScript. We learned about callbacks, callback health, and how we can refactor them into promises. And if promises is too confusing, how we can convert them into async functions to give it a more conventional syntax. And then we've learned DOM. We've learned DOM manipulation, selectors, and events. Now, we have a bit of a bonus over here. If you remember our initial story, right? Initial story of JavaScript, which allows us to render only our run our JavaScript only in our browser. Now, that was possible until 2009, right? Now you cannot run your JavaScript outside your browser. So what we do is there was a developer called Ryan Dahl. He created something called Node.js. So what he did is he took the Chrome's V8 engine, he took that code and put it inside a C++ code. So what happens is now you can run your JavaScript code outside of your browser also. So that gave it a major boost. So this allows us to write backend services, right? Backend, you don't need HTML or you don't need browsers for backend, right? But there was a catch to it. So what was the catch to it? The problem is that you don't have, if you run your JavaScript code outside your browser, you don't get your browser objects like document or window. You don't have access to those. Instead, you have access to your system, right? Because it runs outside of your browser in your system. So what happens is you get access to say your file system, right? You can access your file system, but your browser cannot do that. So that is your Node.js. And then they have something called NPM, Node Package Manager. Now NPM is like, it is a database of lot of open source packages, right? So when Node was introduced, now why do we need a Node Package Manager is that when you say you're building an app or you're building an application, right? Now you might build a whole application from scratch, right? All of its modules or everything. But Node Package Manager helps you with that. So say you want to build something and you have like hundreds of modules in it. Now, most of those modules would have already been implemented by someone at some part of the world, right? Now he would have put those put those on the internet. Now, Node Package Manager allows you to access those modules and use it in your application. So what you have to do now is just concentrate on your logic of your application. All the other modules required to implement those logic will be available through the internet because a lot of open source developers would have provided all those modules, right? Now, right now, as of 2020, there were more than 1.3 million packages on the Node Package Manager, right? So that's a huge number. A lot of people contribute to Node Package Manager, right? Moving on, we have our final bonus. We look into TypeScript. Now, throughout the session, I would have told you about how JavaScript's drawback was not giving you a data type, right? So again, type has a meaning to it. So what does TypeScript mean? It is JavaScript, but it allows you to give a type to your JavaScript, right? Data type. Say you had your function, and it by default it converted it into your strings in your sort function, right? Now instead in your TypeScript we can say that no, I just wanted to sort it as a number. You can do that. So that is your advantage of TypeScript. It lets you, define variables as data types. Then that would allow for, cleaner error free code. Now you don't have to worry about what would happen if my data type changes, right? So that is your TypeScript. Now you learned JavaScript throughout this whole session, right? You learned a lot of JavaScript. Now where can you use it? Where can you move on from now? So you can this is very powerful language, all right? This is very powerful and very popular. So you can do web development, you can do app development, you can do game development, you can do machine learning also. So a lot of fields have JavaScript involved in it. So for web development, you have a few frameworks like Vue.js, you have Angular, you have React, and then for app development, you have something called React Native. These are all frameworks which let you, use JavaScript in it based on the JavaScript language, right? So once you've learned your JavaScript, once you're thorough with your JavaScript basics and some of your asynchronous JavaScript, these will be very easy. There will be just minor changes that you might need to you just need to learn the boilerplate for each of these frameworks. That's all that's needed. Now, I've provided a few resources to you at the end of this session that you can use after this session. So I have put the files that I've worked on GitHub. You can use that, and then this like Google Drive document has a lot of resources you can use. So this brings us to the end of our session, end of our fourth DevCamp session. Now, before we move on, if you have any questions, you can ask. If you have any questions in your JavaScript, you can ask them. And people, don't forget to answer your polls, so we know what you want to learn for the next session, right? So let's wait for 2 minutes. Let's see if you have any questions. So I'll be checking both Teams and YouTube. All right. So I think you guys don't have any doubts anymore. So I think we can end the session over here. Thank you for listening, guys. Stay safe, stay at home, and
hey
hope you
guys,
have something.
yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the session and learned a lot from the basics of JavaScript to using it for various technologies like game development and web development. So we have a poll as to which session you want us to take next. Will it be React.js or Node.js? And please comment and let us know. And another thing that we'd like to say is that we'd like to give, we'd like to wish Sri Charan on behalf of DSC. It's his birthday today. Happy birthday, Sri Charan.
Thank you so much.
And
thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I hope you have a really great day. It'll be really nice if you all can hype on the session saying happy birthday. And also, yeah, we'll share resources for everything that we did take up today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all your wishes.
Okay, cool. I think that's about it. If you guys have any doubts, you all feel free to reach out to us on our social media handles.